I noticed an interesting phenomena in that a neurotypical creator gets autism totally right in every single detail, except for the name, because this character is only accidentally autistic and not in canon, while the characters intended as being canonically autistic are just caricatures, which feel quite insulting. See the series Atypical, where I cringed just from reading the description of what happens in certain episodes. Or The Good Doctor, which I was forced to watch an episode and I felt so gross afterwards, but all the neurotypicals around me praised it what a good representation it was. Back in school, I tried to read the Dog at Nighttime book because someone said it had autistic rep, but I just felt so uncomfortable the whole time, but I couldn't quite pinpoint why back then. So I thought I would make a short video about characters I actually relate to as an autistic person for Autism Acceptance Month. In the background you can see me colorizing a drawing of Rana from the Risen Empire and of Entrapta from She-Ra, which are both characters who are canonically neurodivergent, and in Entrapta's case she's even canonically autistic. You probably know who he is, but just to make sure I explain again. Star Trek: The Original Series is a show about a crew on a spaceship exploring the universe and their episodic adventures. And Spock is one of the main characters. He's an alien from a species called the Vulcans, who have very strong emotions, so they made it their culture to control all of their emotions and only think rationally and logically, which results in them from the outside looking as if they have no or barely any emotions and having these very, very emotionless expressions all the time. But Spock is not just somewhat an outsider on the ship, despite being friends with the captain and the ship's doctor, but also in his own species because he's half human. It's an absolute cliche that autistic people relate to Spock, specifically Spock from Star Trek, the original series, played by Leonard Nimoy. But this is one of the few cliches about autistic people that I found to be true. I remember when I first watched it as a teen, I thought, finally there's someone like me, because I just knew all too well how it felt to try to control my emotions, but I was just not strong enough. And I know also very well how it felt to not fit anywhere, how to try to understand social behavior and just not managing. I tried so hard to control my emotions back then because I was bullied at school and I had to find out that emotions make you very vulnerable. So the smartest thing to do was just not show any of these weaknesses to others. I knew nothing about him beforehand, other than him being logical and having pointy ears. I think the point where I really fell for him was in The Naked Now, or was it The Naked Time? I always get these two confused. The scene where he has this breakdown after the door closes behind him with the polywater infection, making everyone kind of drunk. And every little detail about his breakdown was exactly like when I had a mental breakdown. The way he would just crump his hands and his body language and him trying to calm himself down, but it would just not work. And even this, I don't know, weird little foot kick he would do was just, I had lived through that and I cried with him as I watched that for the first time, because for the first time I saw someone like me living through something like this. This might sound dark, but back then I had this feeling that I needed to be in control all the time and I could only rely on my rationality because all my emotions would only come back to harm me. I got into Steven Universe because a school friend, but also because it was all over the internet at that time. Steven Universe is a kids show, but it's hard to know that from how I would summarize this. And it does tackle heavy themes with quite grace. It's about a young boy with magical powers who lives with his 3 aunts and his single father. But over the turn of the series, it turns out that his mother was the leader of the alien rebellion, and these 3 aunts are the 3 lone survivors of this rebellion, and he has to find out what exactly happened and fight the new aliens that come back to Earth. Pearl, the team's tactician and a masterful sword fighter, as well as quite good with a spear, is one of the aliens, and she was my fave right from the beginning. It's unclear if she's canonically autistic or not. The sources online kind of contradict each other, but she's quite neurotic and constantly nervous, which was something I found very relatable. She's also bad with emotions and emotional regulation. Her fights with Amethyst, one of the other aliens, reminded me quite a lot at my fights with my sister, because we just have such different communication styles. By the way, I don't mean that as ship hate. I don't think that Amethyst and Pearl are like sisters. It was just something I personally was reminded of when seeing them interacting. Feel free to have your own interpretations of them. Another thing I deeply related to was how Pearl is quite insecure and feels she's only worth something if she proves that she's useful to someone or some cause. She's desperate about proving herself and panics when she's not successful. So there's just something about her body language and voice that strikes me as being quite autistic. And one of her defining character arcs is this deep but undefined and badly communicated romance with Rose, the young boy's mother, which is also quite self-sacrificial, similar to the Len and Lennier from Babylon 5. I think the best way to describe Babylon 5 is either as a polit-thriller in space or Game of Thrones in space. It centers around the name-giving space station, which is under control of the Earth military but works as a point to come together for all the different powers in the galaxy. One of these powers are the Minbari, a very religious, very secretive species of, basically these deer aliens. They have this antler-like bone crests around their head, and they wear robes and are very elegant. Their ambassador is Delenn, who is quite secretive and does seem to hide some things, but is also a very wise and kind woman. And her assistant, Lennier, is the character I am focusing on in this. He's extremely loyal to her. They are also very deep friends, have a quite good understanding of each other, but it all starts to become complicated when he falls in love with her and she doesn't quite reject him, but also doesn't quite clarify what she thinks of him. When I saw Lennier for the first time, I directly felt drawn to him, but I couldn't quite say why. I think it was maybe something about his body language or how shy and nervous he was. And relatively soon I would also notice how often he would infodump about topics he found interesting, and then the other person would be bored or cut him off or something like this, which I could relate to. He stops doing that in the later seasons, but I assume that he just learned that people find that annoying. I also oddly related to how little life experience he had, and that he often would even miss something that other people on the space station would think was just common sense and something everybody knows. On my second or so rewatch of the series, I also noticed that he does these calming gestures with his hands all the time. It's fairly subtle, but it's there, and it looks quite a lot like some subtle form of stimming, which is these repetitive movements or things autistic people do to calm themselves down or deal with strong emotions. I think non-autistic people would not understand how that is supposed to be a part of being autistic, but for me it's just so obvious, this detail about how painfully loyal he is and how he even lets this destroy him. Because when you have such trouble with other people, you try to be as loyal and as good as a friend to the small number of people you have as you can, even if it's damaging you. Another detail that it's not often talked about is the gender role subversion, which with that I mean that many autistic people either don't fit or don't want to fit into strict gender roles because, well, I'm not sure how many strictly scientific research is about this, but I, as an autistic person who is quite not fitting into female gender roles, I think this comes from, for one thing, gender roles being social roles, and we tend to not understand these social roles quite as instinctively as neurotypicals. And on the other hand, if you already are an outsider and seen as weird and wrong, it's not as much a burden to do just another thing that makes you an outsider because you already are one. And in Lennier's case, I'm honestly not sure how much he is this in-universe because he's an alien and it's never quite explored, sadly, but the Minbari seem to be aliens that have quite a different gender roles from humans. For example, they don't seem to have any separation between roles a woman do and roles men do. It's also quite visible in the Len. But for the human gender roles of us people watching the series, Lennier comes across as quite feminine and submissive. The clothing he wears is not quite a dress, but it's closer to it than our Western fashion usually is. And there's just something about his body language and expressions and the way he talks that just reads as quite feminine. And I kind of suspect he's hated so much because of that, but that is another topic. But what I related to the most and what struck me as the most autistic coded was Lennier's doomed and beautiful romance with Delenn. For example, him not quite managing to pick up her social cues about if she liked him back or not, like the romantic touch she does all the time that is just subtle enough that it could also be a platonic touch, and all the double meaning stuff she says. I struggled with things like that too in my relationships, and I was unrequited in love too, and it was very painful. Also, the specific way this was a friendship that turned into love, Lennier's self-hate and how he seems to think that there's something fundamentally wrong with him that makes him much lesser worth something than Sheridan, so much that he didn't even try to start a romantic relationship with Delenn, but just said that it wouldn't exist, that it couldn't ever happen right from the beginning. It just seemed to me that there must have been something in his past or in his experiences that made him think that he's so extremely worthless and not someone anybody could ever love. And I related to that quite much too. Lennier also doesn't have enough self-worth to leave the situation as it begins to become darker and more harmful for him. And yes, before anybody writes any mean comments, this situation is both his and Delann's fault for not communicating properly, but he lets himself be treated like this, and I just think it's very clear that this is not something a person who is well adjusted and loves themselves would ever do, and it has to come from somewhere. Star Trek The Next Generation has the same premise as the first Star Trek show, but with a new crew on a new ship. Data is the android second officer, and yeah, I It's hard to describe what exactly his job is, but it's basically a combined function of being the science officer and being the guy who controls all the ship's instruments and sensors and stuff. He is, despite being quite awkward, relatively well ingrained in the ship's crew, but it is noticeable that he's different from them, thanks to being an android. I already made a whole video about data, so here only some short points. I think what I most related to was how he actively had to learn social skills everybody else just knew instinctively. So often he would come to some social interaction and read up how to behave in this specific situation, or observe and then later summarize to himself what he learned about how to behave in that situation. And that was just very relatable to me, and also something I never had seen before in a fictional character, because media just assumes that everybody knows these things already. He also has a tendency to infodump about things he knows or things he's interested in, which I had too, but was criticized quite often because it was seen as annoying. Another thing is his outsider role in nearly every interaction he had. This is something I can remember that is probably best shown in how I took photos for all the, how do you say in English, Abi-Woche, Abi-Feier, basically the celebration before we would get our exams at the end of school. So like parties and dressing up as different things. And I took photos of these events, and while for everybody else their photos looked like they were involved in this, my photos looked like some kind of documentary of some foreign people that would air in National Geographic or something. A very dark one is how Data's humanity and personhood would routinely be denied, or people would argue against it. The biggest example is Measure of a Man, but it happened quite a lot and also sometimes quite subtly. Of course, I never experienced this in this extremeness. Anyway, but it was there in so many small things that I can't even say where exactly these ideas come from. But I think I read so many articles and internet discussions where somebody would just say that autistic people are not really human, or that we are lacking or something, and I truly have trouble to think about myself as a human being. It's this extreme. His friendship with Geordie was just like my friendships, in how nerdy they were together and try to give each other help with social situations, but also talked about some nerdy topics they were interested in. And I don't know, I can't quite put it into words, but just that dynamic struck me as very autistic friendship or nerd friendship. And just like with Spock, I felt so relieved as I first saw Data in TV, because there was someone like me. The Big Bang Theory, this sitcom about a group of 4 nerds and scientists just being nerds together, living their lives. For those of you who don't know it, which likely are very few because it was extremely popular some years back, yeah, it was a thing everybody knew as I was a teen. Neurotypicals seem to think that Sheldon, the leader of the group, is good autistic rep and how real-life autistic people are, but I never saw myself in him. Now, of course, there are some autistic people who are assholes, because in every population and in every minority there are some people who are assholes, because humans are sometimes assholes. That's just how it is. But just something about the way Sheldon was always too arrogant and too entitled and very clueless about his shortcomings instead of insecure about them struck me as not something an actual autistic person would do. He's also somewhat manipulative and uses everybody, and There were just so many very small instances I can't even recount all, where he would just don't react how a real life autistic person would react, but react how a neurotypical person would think autistic people react. I did saw myself in other characters, however. Raj is an astrophysicist and one of the main 4 male nerd clique, and he's also the only person of color in the group, and the others very much let him know that at every possible turn. Like everyone in the nerd clique, he's kind of awkward, but he's even among themselves awkward, which the others don't have. He also tends to get nervous about getting something socially wrong quite quickly. He has a fairly unique way of focusing on things, and even in the context of series and games and movies the others obsess over, he often will have some detail the others hadn't noticed or hadn't thought about in this way. He often tends to be painfully honest and accidentally rude or offensive. What I related most to back then, and what is something that luckily got better by now, is how he always ended up being the third wheel in the group, always being the only one without a partner. In real life, this is probably caused by the very obvious racism of the writers, but he seems to have this I can't describe it any better than having some sort of repulsive aura to potential partners despite being a very gorgeous person. And that is also something I relate to, because as a teen I was conventionally attractive, but still every boy in the class thought I was absolutely disgusting. Raj also seems to have a good heart, at least for sitcom standards, but doesn't quite know how to express it. Like me having trouble fitting the female role, he has trouble fitting the male role, and the other nerds kind of mock him about this. For example, he loves Bollywood movies, he loves nice-smelling shampoo and stuff. He has a small dog, one would rather think a woman has. And the last one is not a real autism criteria, but just the way he deals with this struck me as very autistic and very reminiscent of how I, in my teen years, dealt with this. He reads as bisexual and either doesn't pick it up or is ashamed of it. And yes, there are percentual quite more queer autistic people than queer neurotypical people. And this isn't like conservatives and TERFs tend to say because we are more impressionable. But as I explained, it is because we are already outsiders and already have deeper introspection in who we are through our outsider status. Then there's Amy, who was a later addition to the cast as someone Penny, the main girl, introduced to Sheldon as a date, but turns out the two really do understand each other quite well. She's also quite nerdy, quite smart. She is a neuroscientist. And she later does become part of the group and also becomes part of a female friend group that forms as an addition to the male nerd group. First of all, her way of speaking reminded me at myself. I'm not sure how much this translates into English because English isn't my first language, but she speaks in this very intellectual way with a lot of big words and complicated sentence structures without trying. Like Raj, she's also blunt without wanting to be mean, but it often comes across as mean. She has something that reads to me as special interests, namely I think it's a Western, I'm not sure, but some kind of history show or book. Sheldon once makes a dinner for her, and she also reads and writes fan fiction for this. Like me, she was bullied in school, and this results in her being scared to lose friends. Unlike Sheldon's quite unrelatable attitude of him being the best and being always just proud of himself, she is torn between being proud of herself for being strange but also being quite insecure about it. This also comes from her being socially awkward, but unlike Sheldon, she often worries about this. And she doesn't fit into gender roles too, and kind of reads as bisexual, though given how bigoted the writers of this show are, this is only treated as a joke, sadly. I already mentioned Rana from Scott Westerfeld's The Risen Empire and The Killing of Worlds in my Sapphic Space Operas video, but I mention her here again. As I started reading these books, I did not expect this much canonical diversity. Rana is part of this diversity. She's a POV character in the space opera, a militia worker for monitoring large parts of small objects in space like asteroids, and she leads a quite monotone, sad, lonely life. She struggles with depression the Empire won't cure because they are afraid that then her skills that are useful for them will also go away. But then this changes as she's captured by the cyborg super soldier Head, and over time the two women fall in love with each other. To be honest, at the beginning I wasn't sure if it was just her depression or if she was autistic, but I do relate to quite a lot of her experience, not just related to her depression. Her perception of the world is just quite familiar. How she rationally analyzes her interactions with with other people and even her emotions. She fails quite a lot of personal relationships, it seems. It's not quite the focus, but it's quite heavily implied. And she has given up. Also, she has synesthesia, which isn't just an autism trait, but it is something I have too. To an extent, I don't have it as much as she has, but I do instinctively describe scents and smells as having some shape and texture. And for her, it's, for example, that she describes the movements her lover Head makes as a tasting of lemongrass. Like me, she's constantly nervous. I found it quite charming how Westerfeld describes this as her nervous little world at some point. I don't know, it just struck very true. It was beautiful to see Head help her with her confidence and help her with her depression. She comes into her own and sees what is suddenly possible when her mental illness is dealt with. She's canonically into women. It's not directly mentioned that she's bisexual, but from the description of it, it's, in my opinion, quite reads like it. And she is neither infantilized nor shamed for it. It was just so refreshing. Now comes my personal favorite, Entrapta from She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. She's a chaotic, morally grey engineer in the science fantasy animated series, and at first she starts out as one of the good guys, but is constantly belittled and dehumanized and infantilized by them. For example, they put her on a leash like a dog or a child, and this is treated as a joke. Yeah, this series had quite the flaws, and they also quite take her for granted. She then later defects to the bad guys, who treat her slightly better. Sadly, as it's already somewhat visible from this description, how to put it friendly, there were a few ableists in the crew writing and making the show, and even more ableists in the fandom. But also there's just something so true about Entrapta and how she behaves and her struggles that I made 2 other videos about her already. One is what Entrapta means to me as a disabled person, and the other is why so many disabled people love the monster romance trope, and I will link them. She does have somewhat a different character from me. She's energetic and open, with me being quite shy and quiet, but she also has the same mannerisms and issues. Quite often she's seen as info-dumping about her special interests, science and engineering. She stims by turning into her chair or flapping her hands or jumping around or doing things with her prehensile hair. For example, in the scene as Hordak explains some things about space to her. She also has, and I really love this part, because while there are some autistic people who really don't have empathy, there are also quite a lot who do, and this is very overlooked. Entrapta does have a lot of empathy, especially for outsiders or a robot, but she doesn't quite know how to express that in a way that neurotypicals understand. For me, this was a quite common thing through all of my school time and even later. And in Entrapta's case, this is exaggerated by it being a science fantasy setting, that she is either left behind or seen as a low priority by everybody around except for her love interest Hordak, who is also the leader of the bad guys. And I love so much how she is allowed to have a romance and be bisexual, and then even have a romance with another disabled person, namely Hordak, which reminded me just so much at my own relationships. This is something I think I before that never saw in any kind of media before. The last two are the only own voices representation in this, and it's very noticeable in reading these books. I came across both books through Tumblr. Failure to Communicate by Kaya Sonderby is a Star Trek-like science fiction centering the first contact and language expert Xandri. This is another one I talked about in my Sapphic Space Operas video. Xandri is canonically autistic and uses her outside view of societies to deeper understand how they work. It reminds me of a compliment from teachers I once got on how good I am at understanding the dynamics in the class from the outside. The first scene of the book is literally her having issues with coworkers because said coworkers don't understand how she acts this way. There are also quite a lot of scenes of her stimming, which she does with rubbing her fingers over velvet in the inside of her pockets. Media and higher command treat her as incompetent and insane or like a child, which is something about real-life media that is very noticeable to an autistic person like me, but very likely not noticeable at all to neurotypicals. Luckily, the next one is something I myself escaped from and never had to experience, but there are quite a lot of autistic people who have abusive parents who just want them to be normal and are butthurt about them not being normal, and Xandri's parents are just like that. And another thing I hadn't seen before is how she's scared of intimacy and especially romance, because she's just so scared that they will leave her behind or abuse her for not acting the way she should act, which is also something I quite can relate to and which was a big issue in my personal relationships. Aster is the main character in the adult dystopia An Unkindness of Ghosts by Rivers Solomon. The plot revolves around her, a healer in the lower decks of an racially segregated generation ship, trying to find out what was the truth about the disappearance of her mother. Naturally, this is very dark and contains quite a lot of triggering topics, so be careful. It's nice to see a black, intersex, pro, bisexual and non-binary person who is autistic represented. And if you wondered why she is non-binary and uses she/her pronouns, it's implied that it's because the quite patriarchal society on the generation ship doesn't give her enough information about being non-binary, so she still kinda refers to herself as a woman even if she also identifies as non-binary and is explicitly labeled as such. She is shown to care deeply for her community and her friends, but also her directness is often interpreted as being rude or unfriendly. There are quite a few scenes where she gets into even deeper trouble with the racist guards because they see her autistic behavior as a threat or disobeying them, which is a sad truth for many Black and other people of color. Her detachment from herself when she's under stress just felt quite familiar to something I experienced. I love the beautiful, tender romance with her also queer and autistic fellow healer, Theo. And I'm not gonna lie, this was the first romance between two autistic people I ever saw represented anywhere, and I felt very seen by it. At last, I would like to add 2 more characters I see myself in quite a lot, but not necessary because they are autistic coded. First of all, there's Tally Youngblood, the character I named myself after. She's a teenage girl in a seemingly utopian society where everyone at 16 gets a beauty operation, which is their way of making sure that everybody is treated equally. She's again and again pitted against her female best friend and ends up becoming a reluctant rebel. This is the Uglies series by Scott Westerfield, and there will also be a movie somewhere this year. I just love how flawed Tally is. She managed to ruin all her personal relationships, but she doesn't quite understand how she did that. It just happens again and again. This was something I experienced so many times too, and I even started to doubt at my own skills at being a good friend for somebody. Tally is called selfish multiple times, both in the book and often also by people who read it. In my opinion, she isn't necessarily selfish, but she does have trouble to see how her own actions will influence other people. You get called or implied to be selfish so often as an autistic person, so I related to that quite much. In the beginning, she hardly has any friends, and even as she gets friends later in the series, she always worries that she will repulse them or that they will leave her or that she doesn't fit in. But what speaks against her being autistic is that she's fairly adventurous and very good at improvising in stressful situations. Now, there likely are some autistic people who can do these things too, but I personally don't, and it's not a very common trait. Another character is Harrow from Tamsin Muir's science fantasy Locked Tomb. She's the necromantic hire to the 9th planet. In the first book, her arch-enemy / love interest, female knight Gideon, is the main character, but in the second book, Harrow herself is the main character. She canonically has schizophrenia, and it's described quite intensely, and it feels so raw. I think the author herself also has schizophrenia, but I'm not 100% sure. I felt seen in how disoriented and exhausted that made her, and also in how she doubted her own mind as someone who is mentally ill too, though not quite schizophrenia, but something that has an overlap in some symptoms. Harrow also is quite socially awkward, but I'm not sure if that's because she's autistic or if it's just because she's mentally ill and grew up in a monastery. Still, I felt very seen, even if it was somewhat emotionally exhausting to read just how intensely mentally ill she becomes. So what's the lesson in this? Oh, definitely that there need to be more own voices about autistic characters, more autistic authors, screenwriters, and actors. Neurotypicals need to do research instead of just relying on cliches, and also they need to talk with actual autistic people. They need to write characters first and autistics second. In fandom, neurotypicals need to stop being so damn offended whenever someone thinks some character might be autistic or headcanons them as such. Most non-canon characters headcanon to be autistic just happen to better represent how it truly is than a canon autistic character who is written by some neurotypical and played by neurotypical. Just because you don't recognize it doesn't mean it's not the true lived experience of actual autistic people, because you just know cliches. Ableist neurotypicals aside, I just love how autistic people in fandom transform so many stories to be about them and their experience. Fanworks about these characters truly helped me.